Well, hello and welcome back to Dig Deeper. It's been a while since we've connected with you in this way.
We've had a hiatus. Yes, I don't know if listeners will notice the hiatus, but we've had one.
Yeah, the church year took over and we celebrated Pentecost and all manner of things in between. We had baptisms at St. Luke's. It's all very exciting. But we have re-entered for a couple of weeks to finish off Dig Deeper for this season as we look at Ephesians, and a very warm welcome back to our friend Dr. Stephen Backhouse.
Yeah, welcome back to our remote studio talking, but eventually we might get in the same room together. Wouldn't that be fun?
That's a bit of a spoiler alert for
see if we can make that work.
We would like to make that work. That's what we're going to try and do. How warm is it down there in your shed? Does it do you feel like you slowly cook?
Yeah, well, right now it's got shade. I've got a walnut tree behind me, which is giving us great shade. Sometimes you can hear the walnuts dropping because the squirrels run around on the branches and they drop the walnuts onto my roof. So
I feel like that could easily be a Jesus parable right there. Just have a look at the walnut tree and see how the squirrels knock the walnuts off. Such is the kingdom of God.
Here we are.
It's good to here we are. Well, it's good to see you, Stephen. And just as a reminder to those of us who may be joining this for the first time, or indeed who need a bit of a prompt as to what we've been doing since, we are slap bang in the middle of the household codes that Paul talks about in Ephesians 6, 5 and 6 first. Yeah. And he starts the entire section by saying, submit to one another out of reverence for the Lord, and then he goes into whole conversations about how wives and husbands should submit to one another, how children and parents should submit to one another. That was where we left it, and now we have an interesting one. We have slaves and masters.
Yeah.
So, Stephen, do you want to read?
Should I read it? I've got my David Bentley Hart translation, and in fact, I'm going to be talking about Bentley Hart in a bit. So let's.
Yeah. So why don't we use that?
Okay. So
we're in Ephesians 6.
Yeah, Ephesians 6. Verse
5
and 6. Okay, slaves, heed your fleshly lords as though the anointed, with reverence and trembling in your heart's simplicity, not by affecting slavishness before people's eyes like someone obsequious to human beings, but as slaves to the anointed, doing God's will from the soul, slaving with a good will, as though for the Lord and not for human beings, knowing that whatever good thing each man does, this will be rewarded him by the Lord, whether a slave or a free man. And lords, do the same to them, refraining from making threats, knowing that both their Lord and yours is in the heavens, and with him there is no respecting of persons. Do you want to keep going?
That's a very different version. No, that's fine. We're gonna
now. It's probably worth reading your one, right?
Because I was just thinking that because there's a lot of words in there that are certainly new to any translation I've read before, and so I'm gonna read the N.T. Wright Kingdom New Testament translation, where he translates it as this: slaves, obey your human masters with respect and devotion, with the same single-mindedness that you have towards the Messiah. You must get on with your work, not only when someone is watching you, as if you were just trying to please another human being, but as slaves of the Messiah. Do God's will from your heart. Get on with your tasks with a kind and ready spirit, as if you were serving the Master himself and not human beings. After all, you know that if anyone, slave or free, does something good, they will receive it back from the Master. Masters, do the same to them. Give up using threats. You know, after all, that the Master in heaven is their master and yours, and he is no respecter of persons.
There you go.
That's very different. I mean, sometimes, often when we read these, there's lots of crossover, and you can see where the similarities. I feel like as you read yours and as I read mine, you can see that kind of you're trying to work out which verse tracks with which, because they're really quite different in terms of the language used in their translation.
Hey, this will be fun. We'll have a good old chat about this.
Absolutely right. Well, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, and we mainly focused on the whole subject of the workplace because in what it felt like as one of the applications for us in 21st century Britain is how we are to operate where there are authority and authority structures,
right? Okay.
Where you might have a boss, you might be a manager of others, or indeed you might, well, all of us have people who serve us.
Right.
People who clean the streets, people who serve us at the checkouts.
Yeah, right.
People who are at call centers when we're trying to get our internet fixed. Any number of people that we wouldn't necessarily say are slaves. But there is an authority structure there. There are people serving us and us serving others. There are those that work for us and we work for others. And so that's kind of the line that we went down. But obviously a big part of what is covered here, the massive context here, is that of slavery. Stephen, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. Okay, so first of all, this comes up a lot. So the main question that everybody gets, and if you're a teacher on this, you just almost as night follows day, somebody will put up their hand and they'll say, why doesn't the New Testament condemn slavery? Okay, so so we're going to talk about this, right?
Let's do that. Let's talk about that.
But the first thing I want to say right away is that I am not, anything that follows is not a defense of slavery here. So I'm going to talk about Paul and the attitude towards slavery in the first century. This is not a defense at all of modern day slavery. This is not a defense of Christendom. The sorts of slavery that we're thinking of, the kind of bond, like the kind of ones where you think of like human beings raided, taken from their villages, sold as slaves, put on in a ship, taken to America, taken to in shackles, work in the field. Like that is an evil that stinks to the heights of heaven. I am not defending. That is a deep and utter evil, which has corrupted Christendom to its soul. Yeah. And when we talk about institutional racism, and we talk about sort of structural problems, like we are talking about this.
Yeah.
And that is evil, and I am not defending that at all. And I will say that is not the slavery that Paul is talking about in the first century.
Yeah. And to talk to your first point, that it's a historic evil, but it's also a present evil, I think. Right.
And we're living with the results. We're living with the generational results of that. We can see it all the time. And this is not, what I would say is that Christendom, this kind of Christian empire mindset, had a form of slavery which was worse than anything Paul was dealing with, right? So Christians, not only did they not pay attention to their own Bibles, they made slavery even worse. All right. So let's say that this is not a defense of Christian.
For the sake, they would say, and they wouldn't say, but for the sake of Christian nationalism, which is
empire.
Yeah, this idea of we're going to, even the best-minded people, the kind of, I don't know how best to phrase it, the kind of the most genuinely motivated gospel sharing people would use the mechanisms of empire to do that. And it's that conflation of the two, right? It's that kind of missionaries with the power that comes with empire.
So it's colonialism. It's very much the idea that Christians had this idea that they are bringing some form of civilization to other places, and that the gospel and civilization are the same thing.
Right.
And that one person is superior and there's inferiors, right? Which, by the way, is the exact opposite of the message that Paul is trying to get across here in this passage. When he says God is not a respecter of persons, he's meaning God is not the way we respect people. We put them into these slots of inferior and superior, and of civilized and uncivilized and all that. Paul's whole point here is he said God doesn't do that. So Christianity did that, and I'm not defending it at all.
No.
That is not what Paul is trying to do. So should we talk about the first century? Can we talk about slavery in the first century?
Absolutely. Absolutely. But I think,
and I would also say these passages have been used by slaves, Christendom slave owners, to justify their slavery. And that is absolutely true. And I'm not going to defend that.
And this goes back to the first point that I made actually a few weeks ago on a Sunday at St. Luke's, when we entered this section on the household codes, that to take these passages at face value without any understanding of the context is where we end up ultimately in the evils that we ended up with that you've just described, where people just took things at face value, not understanding the context that it was in. And there are two opposite errors when we look at context. One is that we don't look at it at all and just take simply, this is the word of God and we're just going to accept it as it is without any understanding of what Paul in this case was speaking into. And the other error is to say, well, everything's contextual, so nothing's important anymore now. It's no longer relevant. And those two opposites are not going to help us, but actually like what way you're going to take us now is to understand the context in such a way that it brings life to a passage like this. That doesn't mean that we're apologetic for the passage, but we can absolutely be deeply apologetic and indeed repenting of the history the misreading of this.
I mean, so the other thing to say is that actually the New Testament does condemn slavery. This is the next thing we're going to get to. Things really did change. The Christians took an approach to slavery which was revolutionarily different than anything around them.
Well, let's come on to that. Let's land in the first century. So take us to the first century.
Two people I want to recommend to any readers, if you are or listeners to this. One would be Lynn Cohick. I'm holding it up for the YouTube listeners here. Lynn Cohick, Cohick. And she's written a brilliant commentary on the book of Ephesians. It's just called The Letter to the Ephesians, published by Erdman's. She's really good on this stuff. The other person is David Bentley Hart. So David Bentley Hart wrote a really good, but he wrote a really good book called The Atheist Delusions. And it's all about this kind of stuff. It's about the revolution in the imagination that happened. And so I really recommend both of those books, by the way. And that the sort of headline is that what's happening in these texts, or in the early Christian view of personhood, is that they are having a revolution in the way they imagine what it is to be a person. And they weren't attacking the laws on the books. They weren't like agitating in the streets. They weren't trying to gather themselves together to overthrow the government. What they were doing was they were quietly getting on with just living differently than everyone else around them. And it was corporate. It wasn't individualistic. It wasn't just in their hearts. As a group, they lived different than the world around them. And that difference was so radical that it eventually ended up actually changing the world. Okay. But they didn't do it by writing, we need to change the world. We need to agitate. We need to change the laws. They didn't do that. What they did was they said, we are going to live differently. We aren't going to get our morality from the Roman Empire. We're going to get it from Jesus. And they just did it. And then as Christianity started to grow certainly in the first 3 centuries, their way of living, actually, Roman Empire had to catch up. The Roman Empire itself had to change because the Christians were different. And it wasn't because the Christians were trying to control the Roman Empire. They weren't doing empire here. They weren't trying to get their fingers on the levers of power. No. They were just trying to do the communion as good as possible. Well, they're just trying to do that.
And indeed, when we look at the Roman Empire itself, you said just then that the empire, they weren't trying to build empire. And in fact, when Rome decided to adopt some of these practices of the Christians, it was actually because they realized that the power had fundamentally shifted.
Well, this is David Bentley Hart's big argument. He's like, well, one of the main things is this idea of a person. So we're going to see this happening here as well, actually, is that under Roman Empire imagination, a person, I think I talked about this before with children as well. The person, the word person was a legal entity. I mean, it applied in Roman law to a certain type of male who was a Roman citizen who had a certain amount of land. Okay. So to be a person under Roman law, you had to be male, you had to be a Roman citizen, and you had to be rich. And as soon as one of those things changed, as soon as you stopped owning land, for example, you stopped being a person under Roman law. And under Roman law, persons had some rights, and then everybody else had laws applied differently to other types of people. Now, quite significantly and obviously, people who weren't considered persons under Roman law were women, foreigners, and poor people. Right? And children. So what the New Testament starts to do, and what the early Christians started to do, and this is David Bentley Hart's big point, he said the Christians started to use the word person to apply indiscriminately to everyone. And that they treated foreigners and women and children and poor men and Roman citizens. They treated rich people as persons, but they also treated poor people as persons. They also treated foreigners as persons. They treated women as persons. And they started to use this word, which the Romans had reserved for one very small type of elite. The Christians used this for everyone. And as the Christians started to do this, and as the Christians started to grow, the Roman Empire basically had to change. And we start to see the laws eventually start to change. And that the word person becomes more applicable to a wider group of people, okay? And you're seeing that this is happening right here in this passage. So we've got, so first of all, have a look here at verse 5 and 6, okay? So the word slaves here, often in English, you'll get them, a lot of English translations will say bonded servants because they're trying to tell the difference. Because today when we hear the word slave, we do think of like a human being in chains working in a field or something horrible.
Yeah.
And this is more the sense of, now human beings were bought and sold. There were slave markets. And it was more that it was a human who was attached to a family or to a household, which is why this is in the household codes, by the way. And it was you were a bonded servant. Your life belonged to the household. And in the first century, you could have slaves who were running the house. You could have slaves who had positions in government. It wasn't necessarily servile servitude. It was just that your life belonged to the family that you were, the household that you were a part of. And you could eventually, sometimes you could buy your way into free man. You could be, or you could be given freedom, in which case you then would have your own household. And so free men would often then buy slaves themselves. So now that you have a household, now you have slaves, because that's what households do. Okay.
Yeah.
Now I'm not saying this is good. I'm just saying this is what it was.
This is the way it was. Yeah.
And so Paul here is addressing, it's part of the household codes because you have husbands and wives and children and slaves or bondmen.
Well,
any household will have all these people.
Household in those days wasn't just the 2.4,
it was like a little mini corporation.
Right.
Your household was often, it was your business. It was your meeting place. You might have what we would call extended family. You had cousins and aunts and uncles.
Well, I mean, the elderly would live among you. You would nurse them. There would be this intergenerational sense of everybody is pitching in. And you'd also be part of the family business as well, right? So there'd be, there'd be a trade that would emerge, and everyone would work towards that end. In that way, including the servants.
Now it would be part, and under the kind of Roman imagination or the pagan imagination, it would be part of your right as the owner of the house, as the master of the household, to order those people around. Like, they are inferior to you, right? They're part of your household. They're just like, at the very lowest, they're like animals. They're like horses or donkeys that you would use. More educated slaves would just be your servants who you would command and things. And they didn't have their own, they weren't allowed to kind of determine their own destiny. Okay.
Yeah.
And it would be fully within your rights as a Roman male to order them around. Right.
Yeah.
And so what Paul is doing and the early Christians are doing here is it's exactly similar to the way they did it with wives and husbands and with children and family, is they're trying to say, everyone, we want you to not act towards others according to the hierarchy that's been imposed on you based on this Roman idea of inferior and superior. We want you to act towards each other in such a way that everyone is a superior and that you are willingly offering your will and yourself to other people. You're not doing it because the law demands it or culture demands it. You're doing it because you're in charge. It's self-control. Like, you get to choose how you use your power.
Yeah.
And then they're applying this. They're saying, husbands, you have power, not because Rome gave it to you, but because you are a human being. I want you to use your power by submitting yourself to your wife. Wives, you are not under, you don't have to submit to your husbands because Rome tells you to. You have to submit because a human being should submit to another human being. Fathers, I don't want you to treat your children. I want you to submit to your children or children, I want you to submit to your fathers. Fathers, I want you to submit to children, because human beings give up their will for other human beings.
Yeah.
You don't just clutch to your own rights that Rome gave.
Right.
You. And now we get the slaves and the masters, which is the same thing, which is slaves. I don't want you to act towards your household masters in the way that Rome tells you to act towards your masters, with obsequious, servile, cringing inferiority, where you accept your place in the hierarchy.
Yeah.
Slaves, if you find yourself a slave, I want you to act towards your masters the way Jesus acted towards his disciples, which is he willingly kind of serves them, right?
Yeah.
And then right at the end of that, in verse 6, Paul's going to say, masters, I want you to do likewise.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't want you to lord your power over your servants because Rome tells you that's what you should do. I want you to find ways to submit to your servants.
Yeah.
All right. So you've got this idea that they weren't trying to, again, when Paul says things like, don't heed your masters as though the way Jesus did, with reverence. It's part of this idea of, on the one hand, trying to create a community which is filled with people who are offering themselves willingly to each other.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, not trying to create some sort of violent revolution. They're not trying to bring down he's not trying to preach some sort of violent revolt where slaves take up arms against your masters. He's saying, no, treat them with reverence. But don't treat them with reverence because Rome says do it. Mm-hmm. Treat them with reverence because Jesus says to do it. And what Jesus is doing is really different than what the Rome is doing, right? So they're not trying to overturn the structures. They're just essentially ignoring the structures. Yeah. And that's where you get this idea. So then people say, oh, why didn't he condemn slavery? Well, actually, he does.
Let's hold that thought.
Yeah, right. Okay.
We're going to hold that thought, Stephen, because I want to
have a break.
We're going to have a break. We're going to have a break because I want to come back to that. We're going to take a break. If you want to get yourself a cup of tea or whatever it is, then or you want to take a pause and reflect on what you just heard about this, then go ahead and do so. We'll be back in a second. Welcome back. Well, where we left off just now is this idea that what Paul is trying to do was not overturn the structures that Rome had set culturally in this community of people, but actually how they are to live within them. This kind of mutual submission, mutual self-giving. One of the things before we go on to the big question, which is, well, why doesn't Paul condemn slavery, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But one of the things that I'm struck by is actually, as you're speaking, and we've talked about this before, about the role of Paul is what he's doing is he's taking the teaching of Jesus and working it out. This is how to live. So many of his letters, it's like, people often see Paul and Jesus as in conflict with one another.
No.
It's just like a complete misreading of it all. But to say, actually, no, hang on. And so as you were talking, I was just so reminded of this, when you talked about the Christians began to see everybody as persons. And I'm reminded of that line that Jesus says to his disciples. He says, I no longer call you servants, I call you friends.
Yeah, exactly.
It's kind of this sense of, I am a rabbinic teacher in this context, Jesus is saying, but I don't call you my servants, I call you my friends. You're
right. Yeah, and what you're saying here is Paul trying to work that out. What would that mean? What would that look like? Yeah. Yeah,
and I think about the woman who'd been bleeding for so long, that Jesus encounters and elevates her. He says, daughter, he elevates her personhood when everyone around her is isolating her and everything else, and indeed puts her on a level in that narrative with the young daughter of the nobleman who is dying, and puts her on the same level, and kind of liberates everybody from these kind of status of who is a person, who is not. And of course that in turn is an echo of the creation narrative, which is where a lot of our theology is rooted, which is that we've been created man and woman in the image of God. It brings the image of God back to who we are. And then going back to that emptying, just reflecting on one of my favorite passages, which I always go back to in terms of understanding the work of Christ, is Philippians 2, the Philippian hymn, where he says, he considered himself nothing, making himself the very nature of a servant. And Paul is trying to say, this is how we should be to one another. We should be fundamentally serving one another. If
servant's
everyone
not a
did
bad
that,
thing. Yeah.
If everyone did that, that'd be amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. And so Jesus says, I don't call you servants, but friends. And then he acts like a servant. So it's, he's really messing with the expectations there.
Absolutely right.
And you can see Paul and the other Christians. I mean, Peter does the same thing in First Peter. Like, they're all trying to work out what that looks like.
Yeah. And, so let's go to this question.
Well, the other one would be the book of Philemon. So this question about So yes, it's true. Nowhere does they say I condemn slavery. They don't say that.
Yeah.
And also one of the things they're doing is remember that the Christians are not like this group of super powerful people here. They're not angry right-wing evangelicals who have, in America, who have a lot of access to power. They're not like that. Yeah. They are living under persecution themselves. They're living, their leader had been executed as a traitor to Rome. That's what being crucified on the cross is. It's something you do for people who are traitors to Rome. Mm-hmm. So, there was all these hints that of Jesus saying, I'm not leading a violent rebellion. You're right. Yeah. So people thought he was. So they are being careful here, right? They're trying to figure out, like, how do we work with what we've got?
Yeah.
This is why you're constantly getting Paul and Peter and others saying, like, don't take up arms. Don't seek the sword. Live quietly. Don't seek to kind of, you're not trying to fight Rome. You're just trying to find a way to live peaceably with this Rome that's looming over you. Don't try and fight it. Just ignore it, or try and live under the radar. Right. This is the attitude. They're living under the radar.
Yeah.
So we don't but they don't love it. They're not for it. These aren't conservatives who are loving the empire here. Mm-hmm. Right. They're not flying Roman flags at the front of their churches. All right. They are resisting empire in all its forms, but they're resisting in the same way that a rabbit resists the farmer by hiding in its holes in its burrow, right? They're not trying to fight the farmer. They're just trying to get on with their lives.
Yeah.
Without constantly having to deal with the Rome, which is why in the book of Revelation, they actually refer to Rome as the beast. The beast is Rome. How do you deal with the beast? Well, you basically have to wait for Jesus to deal with the beast. And in the meantime, we have to get on with life and be witnesses, not warriors. We're witnesses, not warriors. So one of the things you see this working out really clearly is in the book of Philemon. I don't know if you know Philemon.
Yeah, we taught on it actually not so long ago. And I say not so long ago, I feel like it was pre-COVID, but I mean, I can't remember. In recent history, I've taught on it. We did a mini series on it.
It's very famous, isn't it? Because you got a slave who's run away, and Paul, he runs back. He goes to Paul. So slaves are Christians, they're fellow believers. Yeah. A slave runs away. He perhaps has got some of this revolutionary spirit. He runs away, and Paul sends him back to Onesimus, to the master. But famously, he says to Onesimus, I want you to treat the slave like Onesimus is the slave. He says, I want you to treat him like a brother. He's my brother. I want you to treat him like a brother. Mm-hmm. I no longer call you servants, but friends, right? Daughter, your faith has healed you. All these things. Yeah. And it's in those kind of moments when you say, I no longer call you a slave, but a brother. I want you to treat this person. I don't want you to hold on to your rights that Rome will give you about what to do with slaves who run away. I want you to treat him the way you treat a brother. That is basically the rabbit living in the hole condemning the farmer. All right. That is the moment. These are these moments when Paul says God is not a respecter of persons, or not a respecter of hierarchy and superiority. That is these moments here. And these moments really did have an effect. Like like I said, eventually Rome started doing this as well. Eventually people started to treat everyone, or recognize that everyone was a person. Famously, you have, under Roman, we have the stories of martyrs. So we're going beyond the New Testament here. We're going in the first 2 centuries of Christianity here. Yeah. So we all know that, Rome persecuted Christians. Okay. But Rome didn't persecute all Christians everywhere. It didn't have the resources to do that, or the will. Persecution for the Christians was relatively rare, but it was specific. So when it came down on someone, They didn't just sweep up any old Christian. They swept up the ones who were seen to be the public leaders.
Yeah.
Right. To make an example of them.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, it is highly significant how many martyrs were slaves and women. We have all these accounts of martyrs. Slaves and women show up all the time.
Wow.
In these martyr accounts. When Rome looked at the Christians going, who are the people who have the most influence in these Christian groups? Who can we choose to make an example of to the rest of them? Oh, I know, that slave woman over there. That tells you something about the status that slave women had within the Christian community.
Wow.
Okay. And you have all these stories of slave women who have been swept up, they're in jail, and then bishops in the church are coming to these slave women asking for advice, asking them to settle disputes and things like that.
Wow.
So it's obvious that something is going on here, that the early Christians are organizing themselves within their own community, very different to the way that the world outside them is organizing themselves.
Yeah. Wow.
Okay. And that's just like cultural historical evidence.
Wow.
And so you can see that the proof is in the pudding. It's not so much in their writings, it's just in the way they're acting towards each other.
Right.
And then you see the later sort of sadder, well, what you then see is as Christianity in the 300, 400s becomes more established, that revolutionary idea fades and they start adopting the Roman way again. So as Christians become more politically powerful, they start acting less Christian and they start acting more Roman. Okay. Which is then where we start to get empire again. So the seeds for Christian empire and the kind of slavery that we're familiar with today didn't come from the New Testament. It was coming from Christians giving up the New Testament, basically, in order to adopt the practices of the people around them, of power around them. But within the New Testament itself, there's this seed of an idea which is leading to practices which are very countercultural. And what you then see is as Christendom develops, as empire develops, as slavery, as the kind of slavery that we're aware of, that kind of putting human beings in chains kind of slavery, wherever you find Christian voices who are opposed to Christian empire and Christian slavery, it's Philemon that they're drawing from. It's Ephesians 5 and 6. So Christians are using the New Testament to fight Christian empire. All right. They're getting their ideas from Jesus, from Paul. They're not getting their ideas from some kind of like secular Enlightenment humanist. They're getting their ideas from their source texts. And they're saying we have departed from our own original ideas here.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm not 100%. I'm very much against Christendom, but I'm very much for the early Christian imagination. So they aren't the same thing.
And if people want to read more about that, Stephen, is it, where would they go? Is that the Lynn?
So Lynn Cohick, I mean, she's just really good on the book of Ephesians.
Yeah.
David Bentley Hart, The Atheist Delusions. Yeah. He's really good on the change in the moral imagination that Christianity brought about. Yeah.
Yeah. Really helpful. Just to bring us to close, I'm just curious, because as we wrestled with this passage as a staff team about how we would kind of address it, I think one of the questions that came up, at what point, and you've kind of alluded to this already, that the Christians just lived it out. They were the rabbits in the hole, condemning the farmer, as it were. At what point, where is the role for protest? Where's the role for create a movement that does speak out against Rome or whatever it is? Where's the point where actually living in the hole doesn't help anymore? Does that exist?
I think see, this is a really good idea, and this is a good point. And I think it's something like what you notice the early Christians doing is they were using the power that they had. Like it's not grab more power for yourself. It's what power have you got and how do you use it well?
Okay.
All right. So today so in the first century, it's like, what power have you got? Well, I don't have very much power, but what I've got, I'm going to choose to use in this way.
And which mostly was a lived example, right?
And it was a lived example. You didn't have power to change the institution stuff.
Right.
I think today we could say, what power have we got? Okay, how do we use it well? And that's where you start to lead to things like protest or agitating for change. Okay, so it isn't a sort of a let's do what we can to get as much power as possible to lord it over others. It's more like take a stock take. What have we got right now?
Yeah.
How can we use it for others and not for ourselves? And I have to say, let's be honest, a lot of Christians today, when they do their stock take of power, they're trying to use it to defend themselves and their institutions or their practices. They're not really, quite often that's what you see. But I think at its best, it's when a Christian group says, what power have we got? Maybe through inheritance, maybe we just inherited it. We were born into this world which gave us certain types of power or land or money or a voice. How can we use that for people who don't have the voice?
And it goes back again at a corporate level, goes back to exactly what we've been talking about laying down one's own power for the sake of somebody else. And in a marriage, that's the husband and the wife. In a family unit, it's the children and so on. But at a corporate level, you're saying we as a group of people are laying down our, what good we could gain for ourselves.
Yes.
And actually speak on behalf of those that don't have a voice.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's, when it works well, that's kind of, I think, how you can tell whether it's working well or not. It's like, are Christians using the power that they've got? And let's be honest, through no work of their own. Just like Paul's talking about here, is like, masters, you were just born into this. Like the Lord, you didn't do it. You're not a master because you worked really hard. You're a master because you were born into Roman Empire and it gave you that position. And it's not because you are so great. And slaves, it's not because you're so bad. Like this is just the world we live in. So I think today Christians could take a leaf out of that book and say, well, okay, through nothing to do with us, we live in this world in which we've inherited this power. How can we use it well rather than badly? And the model for how you use it well is that, are you using it to further and defend your own rights and interests, or are you using it for the rights and interests of others? And that's where I would go if I was trying to find a justification for public protest or agitation, for sure.
Yeah. Very helpful.
And then you have to always watch out for the fact that what happens when the bullied becomes, when they're in charge, right? So this is why the Jesus way is always on guard against, like, once your protest worked, or once you are in charge now how are you going to act? Like, are you going to become the oppressor, or are you going to be like?
That's always been the case, right?
Always the case.
The bullied becomes the bully, and
so we just always have to watch out for that, right?
Yeah.
But this is why I actually am very, very sympathetic to this. Like how we talk about privilege or inherited privilege or structural racism, stuff. Yeah. These things are real, and it doesn't mean that each individual within the institution is racist or feels racist. Yeah, when we talk about things like structural privilege or structural racism, we're saying all of us were born into a world in which these patterns and institutions were already set in place.
Right.
And those patterns and institutions themselves have come from bad uses of power or exploitation.
Yeah. And some are conscious and some are unconscious.
Yeah, and we're not saying everybody is consciously a racist. What we are saying is that everybody involved has been born into a history and a culture which they didn't have anything to do with, but which itself is using its power and its money badly. Like it's come from somewhere. It's come from exploitation. So when we hear the word institutional racism or whatever, it's not meant to be like this a condemnation of your inner soul. It's meant to be a recognition of, like, oh yeah, we were, through no fault of our own or through no work of our own, we were born into these positions.
Yeah.
What do we do with the power that we now have? Do we use the power to preserve our institutions and to keep the institutional racism going? Or do we use it to give it away? Do we use it to dismantle these things? And it's like this, like, how are you using well what you've inherited?
Right.
Are you using it well?
And not just that, but how can we operate while the change is taking place, as Paul is talking about here, although he's not seeking revolution, in doing so through people acting differently within the context of slaves and masters here, or bond servants and masters here. Yeah. There was an expectation that change would take place in due course. But in the meantime, we need to operate well within it.
Yeah, right. So it's kind of like, look, the the laws aren't going to change anytime soon, but we might as well get on with acting correctly now.
Yeah.
And guess what? The laws did change eventually, right? So we're not saying that it's one thing or the other. We're just saying, I think we sometimes live in a world in which we think until the laws change, we can't be different.
Right.
And the early Christian experience was the other way around, is that they acted differently and then the laws changed. And both things were good. Like, I'm not saying ignore the laws changing. I'm just saying, like, get the cart, see what position the cart and the horse are in. And it seems like that is part of it, is that just start acting this way now and really commit to it, to the point where you become a martyr, by the way. All right. So it doesn't make life easier, but you really commit to this new way of life. And you don't think that I can only live this way if the whole world agrees with me. So the Christians weren't putting their energy into making the whole world agree with them. They put it into just living rightly. Yeah. And then things started to change.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, and Stephen, thank you for your time. It's so helpful. As ever, I always start these things thinking, oh, I'm sure we'll have half an hour.
You thought there was 2 verses, we wouldn't have enough.
2 verses. This is going to be a short episode, and boy, did we open up a lot of stuff. Stephen, thank you so much for your time. Looking forward to seeing you next week, where hopefully, all being well, spoiler alert, you'll see us together in one room, not separated by miles of countryside. So we'll look.
I'll bring a walnut leaf with me to wave over you. So
absolutely, I would like some walnuts from the tree, please.
All right, friend.
You can leave the squirrels at home. All right, thanks, Stephen. Take care. Have a great week. Take care,
everyone.